Go forth.
Brilliant. Okay. I'm going to talk to you about the value of information today, and that's a topic that I'm fairly keen on. What we'll be doing to start off this is that I have a card game that I've made, and I've got pictures of me playing this card game at different EA conferences here in Singapore and Australia. I've got a physical version, but sadly, I'm not giving this talk physically. So I created a digital version for you guys to play, and that's at voi-game.samnolan.me. I'll pop it in the chat.
I got it.
Yeah, you've put it in the Nicole. Yes,
Yes.
thank you. And I will have people see if they can complete that just real quick. And once I get a few people have done their submissions, I might continue forward. Because I think that's a really good way of thinking about how value of information works. Just to explain the game, these are the physical cards that I have. You have new and upgraded mid-journey digital cards. These are DALI mini cards. It works that you have 7 interventions, and you can either choose to donate to an intervention or evaluate an intervention. And donating to an intervention gets you the utility of that intervention, but you don't know what the utility of the intervention actually is. But what you do know is an 89% confidence interval that is what is on the other side. For in the physical card, it's on the other side, and yours it will just show up. Every evaluation costs 1 token, and every donation costs 1 token. And you can distribute your donations any way you want. Your utility is whatever the amount of tokens you've given times whatever the utility actually is on the other side of the card. And your goal is to get the highest utility. But the idea is that any money that you spend on evaluating is not money that you can spend on donating. So you need to be careful and understand how much that information is really worth to you. This is going to be a very interactive talk, by the way. So if you have any questions, feel free to like throw them out and just unmute yourself or something.
Why did you pick a 89% confidence interval?
That's a great question. It's 89% log normally distributed. 89% is it's kind of a joke, but it
Okay.
comes from called statistical rethinking. And what he does is that he represents all of his creatable intervals in 89% intervals so that the frequentists don't judge them as p-values. So
Okay.
the joke is that it is as arbitrary as 0.05.
It is pretty
It,
arbitrary.
yes,
Got it.
it's chosen for the point of arbitrariness.
Okay, cool.
When I ran this talk at Rethink Priorities, one of the attendees, I think, cheated and waited to the end of the talk to finish the game, and got the highest score out of anyone at the Rethink Priorities team, which is not fair, but is what it is. Okay, I'll move on. So the contents of this talk, I'm just going to give a quick introduction for myself. We're going to go through some qualitative and quantitative considerations of this game that we just played, and how we might go about trying to optimize and finding the way to get the most amount of points, and therefore like understand how value of information works. I'll talk about some uses of value of information and the work that I've done, the different types of value of information, and why you might not want to use value of information. And I'm going to be asking you lots of questions throughout this, so feel free to interrupt with questions. I've got lots of question breaks too. So first of all, who is this being before me? I'm Sam. I've been working with Query on their probabilistic language called Squiggle. I also led a small research team to try to quantify all uncertainty in GiveWell's cost effectiveness estimates and do a value of information analysis. I like Dungeons and Dragons vegan cooking, being extremely pedantic about math and inventing games like this one. If you're listening to this recording, I would implore you to try and have a go yourself and see how your scores went. You'll be able to compare yourself to other people before you find out what the optimal strategy is. But the first thing that I would like to point out with this game that you've just played is that the game is stochastic in that the best strategy doesn't mean the best score. The best score would obviously be if you somehow knew what the actual the actual best card was, then you would just put all your money on that card. But obviously that might not be available. The best card might not obviously be the best card, and there might be a chance that there'd be other big cards that are the best card. So because of this, like value, when you research something that can sometimes be a good thing for you, sometimes turns out to be not that promising. When I say value of information, most of the time I mean expected value of information, which means that over all possible ways that this could have been resolved, it was probably a good bet to either like research or not research into a charity. This is an optimal sampling problem. It is like trying to work out which ones that we should sample from, or if we should sample from, or if we're just happy with the information that we have. I'm going to throw it out now for maybe Raja. You played this game. What were your considerations? Which charities did you research, if any, and why? I'm curious.
Yeah, so I guess I just started off with the one which I assumed would be the best worth evaluating, that being the Save the AI Research Institute. It's just the values were quite high. The sort of I could take the perhaps the mean of the utility and just see that it had the greatest chance of being the highest. And then once I saw that, it turned out to have a utility of 50, which was pretty high. And so I was like, okay, that's pretty good. Let me go to my second best option. I think that one has a decent chance of having greater utility. And if it does, I have enough tokens to like make up for that. The token waste not wasted, but used for the information gathering. I used it on one of them and the utility was lower. And so I just went for the AI research. I did spend one more on evaluation, but that was just out of pure curiosity, just to like, so I wouldn't beat myself up over it if I just picked a random one and saw it that it was like utility 70 or 80. But yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you've definitely hit on a couple of really important points here. Where one thing that might be important to consider is, say I don't have an evaluator, say that I can't actually learn about these charities, what would be the best options for us to put in? Now, one possible way of getting like the expected value of donating to a charity would be to find the average of the upper and lower bounds, and that's kind of what I do, but in my head. In truth, that's not really how it works because they're log normal distributions and not normal distributions, so it's not symmetric. But for now, that's a decent approximation. And like you would have found that the Save the AI Research Institute has the highest expected value. But that brings us to the point that you were saying at the end, which is like you were researching out of curiosity to make sure that you wouldn't kick yourself afterwards. So I will say that you're kind of saying that the value of information is linearly, I'm going to add linearly because that's true mathematically, proportional to the chance that you're going to change your mind. When I say change our mind here, say we have like the best charity and we research it. Changing our mind would be if we find out that that charity is worse than the expected value of our second best charity. And in that case, you would find that like I've changed my mind. I'm now going to put my money from the Save the AI Research Institute to one of the other ones that's second best, like Stupidity Prevention International or the Anti-Measles Association, or I think Against Bioweapons Agency, any of the 47.5 ones. The second thing, I might throw this to Nicole. What if we were loaded? What if we had like 100 tokens rather than 10? How would that change the way that you made your decisions?
I don't think it should
You don't think it
because,
should?
well, I mean, you're still trying to make the best decisions regardless of the amount of tokens that you have to distribute. Well, the evaluation only costs what? Sorry, I'm rethinking my answer now. The evaluation only costs one token, and so it's relatively much cheaper now to evaluate. So it becomes more relevant to find the best opportunities and put the remaining tokens after the evaluations into those initiatives.
Yeah. The second point is probably more close to the mark, which is that when you have information, you are like slightly better at performing at allocating decisions than you'd be otherwise. And as of such, being slightly better is better when you have more decisions to make, when you have more resources banking on that decision, which means that value of information is also linearly proportional to the amount of resources banking on that decision. If there's no resources banking on the decision, then it's not really worth you spending much time researching about it. If there is, then it's worth doing that. And that's why it might be like a good idea for GiveWell to do this in-depth research when we can just kind of like cite their work because we don't have as much money banking on it. So now we're going to go away from this qualitative consideration and into a more quantitative consideration about how do we put numbers to calculating the value of information? How would we work out whether we actually should research or not research in this particular game? One way that I'd like to think about this is that we have two states, say, this is just like in the first step of whether we research or not research. We have the value of your uninformed, which means if we didn't have any evaluations, if we couldn't evaluate, what would be our expected performance? And that's very simply the donating to the charity with the highest expected value. So that's the Save the AI Research Institute. It has an expected value of 51 because it's normally distributed roughly. And I've written it down there. That's just the charity with the maximum expected value. The second one is the value of the informed. So how much value would we get if we were to research a charity? And in this case, top charity is better than the second best charity, and we just donate towards that, or it's worse, and then we would donate to the second best charity. So this is just assuming that we're not going to do any research down the track even further. We're either researching once or just donating all that money to the main charity. So to demonstrate this, I have a little example. This is Squiggle. This is a language that I've been working on for a little while. This here represents two distributions, which is the value of the uninformed and the value of the informed. So the value of the uninformed is just the different possible cost effectiveness values that the charity with the highest expected value could be, but the value of the informed, it could be anything higher than the second best charity. But if it is lower than the second best charity, which is this point here, then we're just going to choose the second best charity, which has an expected value of roughly like 45.39. So it's the same as this orange distribution, except all the probability mass that is lower than the second best charity is kind of like pushed up to the top one, to that one point. You can just find, obviously, the value of the informed because it's got only probability mass that's been pushed up, has a higher expected value than the probability of the uninformed, and we can find the expected value of the uninformed and informed here, which is 51 and 5 in this case. Does that kind of make sense to people? This is where people start to get confused, usually.
Do you assume anything about the discreteness or smoothness of the probability spaces?
No, I didn't. They can be any probability distribution. I'm just finding the maximum of one charity and the mean of the second best charity, and that can be done on any distribution.
Over what kind of time frame?
Time frame?
I can imagine a situation where, you're trying to maximize EV in the short term, but, you get taken out of the game, for example, right? So your long-term EV gets completely smashed.
Okay. Time doesn't exist in my model.
Okay,
Currently,
gotcha. Yep.
in my
That
model,
makes
it
sense.
exists as a game where you have
So
you go from state to state.
Right. No, of course. You're
It is kind of
assuming
discrete, I guess.
it's a finite and not a transfinite game.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
That'd be interesting, doing like a value of information analysis where you can find a portion of a piece of information. I guess you could probably approximate that. You can kind of do that, I guess, later on again when you find out, like, instead of finding perfect information, you find out imperfect information.
Yeah.
Going back into our slides, we find that if we have the expected value with no research, if we just donate everything to the Save the AI Research Institute, is going to be 51, the expected value of the Save the AI Research Institute, times 10, the amount of tokens we have to spend on it, 510. The expected value with no research is that we take one token away because we used it for an evaluation. We have an expected performance of 55, and then we get to 495. And this basically says that it was actually better to never research in the first place. So we should have just spent our money all on the Save the AI Research Institute because 510 is larger than 495. Another way of putting this is that the expected value of perfect information is just the difference of the informed and the uninformed states. So that's 55 to take 51, which is 4. So that means that the value of perfect information is 4. We need to work out whether we get enough value from that information to justify us spending one token. So in this case, 4 times 9, which is the amount of tokens we have left, is lower than 51. And we lost 51 utility from spending the token because we could have donated it. And we didn't get 4 times 9 is lower than 51. So it's not worth it. So in this case, researching is too expensive. It's better just to donate. And people don't like me when I bring that on them. So I think there's that question break.
I have a sense that research is always going to look expensive looking forward and super cheap looking backward if you do it correctly.
Okay. I feel like if you do it looking backwards, it looks very similar. Why do you think that it looks cheap going backwards and forwards? Like what do you think makes the difference?
Well, I mean, in that AI example, right, people are talking about these silly numbers, right? Oh, it's very expensive to train this model because it's $500 million, right? They're looking at it on an absolute sort of basis. But, if there's any sort of non-zero chance that it could take, pick a number, any number, 10 to 40 to 90% of the economy, and then apply any sort of discount rate that you want, it's going to just look ridiculously inexpensive, right? So that's just an example.
Yeah, I mean, like, you could probably guess that beforehand as well. If you had a distribution that was like, well, if it takes up X% of the economy, then that's a very high expected value of that charity. Yeah. That being said, these types of decisions are usually between, you have to choose between whether you're researching or whether you're donating to a charity. So in this case, I'm not really sure what are those two decisions. Like you can either invest in research into solving some sort of question in AI capabilities or what have you. But then what's the other option? Where are you donating to? How does that fit into this?
I think a lot of the topics you're talking about has this sort of self effect or self recursive property whereby there are things that you can research that can shift the entire probabilities quite substantively. And it makes it quite difficult to look on a forward basis because we're running it once, right? I guess we can do some kind of Monte Carlo, but we're running it sort of once, whereas it can become quite complex very quickly in terms of the outcomes.
I'm not sure if this answers your question, but usually value of information analysis is contingent on your ability to like estimate a possible probability distribution of what you're researching. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If we find that, I don't know, what is the cost effectiveness or the value to the economy of artificial intelligence versus, then there's like, where's the donating? Like
Yeah.
donating it to, I don't, okay, researching about artificial intelligence capabilities versus donating to the Against Malaria Foundation, where you might find that like, oh, well, checking whether it's actually that good might be better, you know, because you can reduce uncertainty. And I guess there's also a tie that usually a lot of the time when you donate to a charity, you also reduce uncertainty because you find out more information about it. So that kind of makes it a bit more complicated, and I've kind of like separated it in this.
Yeah, gotcha.
Anyway, cool. When could this be used? Does anyone see like what sort of practical applications could someone use this type of analysis? I'll call out Roger.
I guess I have sort of one question just before.
Oh yeah, go. Sorry.
It would be how many sort of tokens you have really does affect whether you want to do more research. Partly because if we're just looking into the future, if as long as you, even if the next best thing is ever so slightly better, over time that sort of the utility would add up to being worth whatever the cost of research might be. And so if you had like 1,000 tokens, you're just researching everything. And so like how does the number of tokens come into play? I imagine taking the limit, it's always just going to be close to, if there's something better to be researched, then do the research, because if you have loads of tokens, then it's going to be worth it. Or if you expect the future to be long, it's going to be worth it. How does that come into play, and how do you model that?
Yeah, so how we might do that is that we can take a look at the expected value of perfect partial information formula. You want to make sure that you get your value back when you do research. And this 10 minus 1, that could be massive. That could be like thousands. And then it's obviously worth researching this particular charity. And then that's how that comes into play, is if you have more money. If this is like 1,001 times 51 versus like 1,000 times 55, then like 1,000 times 55 will be bigger than 1,001 times 51. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, how do you remove the somewhat unintuitive or unhelpful answers that might bring, especially when you consider assuming that the information will continue to be valuable for a long time. And so if we did this for like medicines, I could imagine somebody saying, we could buy these drugs. Yeah, that's great. But if we did this research, the research value going into the future from the life saved is just so much higher. How do you not stumble into that mistake?
Yeah, I mean, like, that's definitely a very good point. I'm assuming you only have 10 tokens and then, like, the game ends, you're dead. In real life, often information just kind of persists for a very long time and might be relevant to a very large amount of decisions. Value of information comes from decision theory. And because of that, you have to think about some particular theoretical decision that it's relevant to if you want to calculate it quantitatively. For instance, GiveWell, it might be worth doing more research because their findings might be relevant to many, many decisions down the road. Often when you calculate value of information, it's not so close like this one. Sometimes you can look at it and it'd be like, well, actually, the value of information is like 10 to the power of negative 10, and you'd have to have billions of dollars of stuff on this question that's kind of arbitrary. I think sometimes it can provide you hints there. But yeah, you're very right, because in the real world, we probably just have more resources and more money banking on decisions, hopefully.
Thank you.
Cool.
I was going to say, to go back to your question from a moment ago about how this style of toy problem is seen in industry, I actually don't know the answer to that, but I would say that it reminded me of the secretary problem, which was made famous in the book Algorithms to Live By, in a somewhat questionable example of like applying math to dating. I think it's too much of a toy example for it to actually have applications to anyone's dating life. I mean, applications maybe, but like a hard and fast rule, definitely no. But this idea of explore for a certain period and then exploit, and that's kind of how I thought about the game. Now that I'm hearing your methodology, it's clear that I had the wrong first step. But I was like, okay, well, I'm going to explore and then I will eventually like switch over to exploiting after a certain cutoff. So that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's like, it does kind of characterize many of the explore exploit problems. They can get pretty difficult pretty quickly, but yeah, it does provide some form of solution.
Well,
I reckon you could do a mapping to the secretary problem, but it might be tough.
yeah. And I think you bring up an important point, which is like you should evaluate before you explore or exploit to determine whether an exploration phase is even valuable, given the probabilities and the constraints of the specific problem.
Yeah.
Which in this case, it was just exploit.
Yes.
Exploit only.
Exploit only. I didn't
Right.
do that deliberately. I just picked off the first few cards and then I just calculated the result for it. And then I was like, oh, it's just exploit, right? Anyway, it's what it is. So in the real world, this is done particularly in trying to work out whether it's valuable to run clinical trials on drugs. So an example might be like, well, if we want to work out whether a drug is the best option that we have available, but we actually have a pretty good option and it's probably not likely that it's going to be better than that option. So is it really worth doing the clinical trial, or should we just not worry about it and just use the first drug? I don't think it's done as much in the econometric style, but in development policy, but it could technically be used to be like, okay, we're not sure about the effect size of this particular intervention. What would be the value of knowing the effect size through a large scale RCT? And that could be quite large and quite relevant. I did it with the Rethink Priorities team, and I told them that it could be a little bit more vague. You could try working out whether you want to fund the worldview diversification team that they're currently building. How likely is it that this organization is going to change people's minds about things, and is it actually worth getting in 3 full-time people to do that? And hopefully they at least did this intuitively when they were going through building their team. A little bit more practically, I use value of information analysis to work out how valuable it would be to know information about GiveWell charities. So this is an example where you can tick which charities you would like to research, and then through a little bit of smart algebra, you can, instead of casting it in terms of like how much money you should donate to one charity or the other, I can say that it should take up a maximum of 11% of a decision maker's budget. If you somehow spend more than 11% reducing the uncertainties of these charities, then it absolutely wouldn't be worth it. You should be exploring 11% of the time and exploiting the rest. In the actual notebook, you can tick and untick these to get like different results. That's pretty cool. I think this has been brought up a couple of times, but what's wrong with this model? And I feel like I might call out Edward, because I feel like he's been calling out what's wrong with my models for a while.
I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the model. I think there's just ideas that I have about how to improve,
Okay.
said model.
Is there anything simple, too simplistic? I've mentioned this a couple
you
of
got to
times.
start somewhere, right? I think that the value is having some, as my friend says, have a version -1. It's so bad that, you wouldn't even do it, except you do it. I'm not saying it's this, but I think you got to start somewhere, right? And then put it in front of people that can do a good job of making sure how anti-fragile this thing is.
Okay. Maybe I can call out Roger again. Do you have any ideas for what's an obvious? I think there's one particular obvious problem with this and how it has a corollary in real life.
Well, I would just want to add more places where uncertainties should be. For example, certain interventions or certain drugs, certain trials, they might have a higher percent chance of giving you more valuable information, where information comes with a sort of a spectrum of itself, rather than just instantly knowing one utility. You'd more likely narrow down the confidence intervals instead. And even then, adding that probabilistic element would be, I think, another thing to add to the model.
Yeah, and this is exactly what I was getting at, is that currently we're talking about perfect information. And most of the time, we don't have the luxury of finding out perfect information. We only have the ability to reduce our confidence intervals. This is my little hierarchy of value of information. The idea is that the big ones are more general, smaller ones are more specific. The more general it is, the more difficult it is to calculate. The more specific, the easier it is to calculate, but is kind of a little bit idealistic. So at the very bottom, we have what we've been doing so far, value of perfect information or value of clairvoyance, which is what if you actually somehow did all the research and you got a perfect actual value, what the value would that be? And next, we're going to talk about the value of perfect partial information, and we'll talk about the rest a little bit later. Perfect partial information is the value of reducing all uncertainty in a single parameter in some economic model. So in this case, it would be, we might do value of perfect partial information to find out how much would it be worth reducing all uncertainty in the effect size of the insecticide treated nets on malaria. And then that way you could work out, because RCTs only usually work on 1 or 2 parameters in a model that might be relevant, you can work out how valuable it would be to reduce that particular parameter. Value of the uninformed is exactly the same because you still can't research. I've just changed the notation a little bit. This finds the value of information of 2 charities, and I'm going to define, say, the cost effectiveness of a charity as like a function of a whole lot of other parameters or random variables, and these are all just distributions. And the value of the informed is that if I could, like, this is a bit of an odd note syntax here, which just means the expected value of y kind of excluding yi, which means that we're going to create a distribution of expected values if yi was any given particular value. What this means intuitively is that if you were to research one parameter, this will shift the expected value of the charity in some particular way, and we want to work out whether that shift would be enough to change our mind and get us to actually donate to something different, and how valuable would it be if we changed our mind. So one example of this is my partner wrote a rough and unfinished Catherine Hamlin Fistula Foundation cost effectiveness analysis for the purposes of our Giver work. And in this, we got a value of perfect partial information in researching every parameter within the model. So for instance, if we have an uncertainty in the value assigned to 1-year education doublings of consumption, and I say that it would be worth 2-point-something% of a decision maker's budget if you were to reduce all uncertainty in that particular variable. And that's the same for all of these ones, which I think was pretty cool. The average birth per woman, and the highest one is proportion of career midwives, not with CHF, which I forget what that parameter is before. And this is Hannah at the Trajan House, where we did a little bit of work on the project. To go even further, more general, and to go beyond this point of partial perfect information, you can get the value of sample information, which is what's the value of taking a household size in Give Directly's cost effectiveness model, and then using that to update your estimate about where the mean household size is for the purposes of the cost effectiveness model. And then you can work out, well, yeah, what's the value of that sample, reduction of uncertainty of a particular parameter. That's the same sort of idea, where we work out how likely is it that this sample that I draw is going to change my mind about something, and if so, is it actually worth doing? Imperfect information is just more general. It's like, given any piece of information, how much is going to change your expected value, and therefore how much what's the value of that imperfect information. I have another question break here.
I'm mostly interested in the inverse of the part, like how good the estimate of the partial is in that equation. You know what I mean?
How good the estimate is of the partial.
Yeah,
Clarify a bit further.
sure. I mean, all of this is based on what we currently know, right? So I think the more that you can understand how partial, even if it's a relatively low confidence estimate of this partial, it's extremely valuable. It can be extremely, extremely valuable.
Yeah. I think it can be quite valuable to work out the value of perfect partial information, especially considering
versus the perfect, right? I think a lot of people, if I were to break this input down into whatever the tokens, right? People might weigh perfect much higher than partial. But in my mental model, the partial is much more important, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons why one might want to go for more perfect information rather than like imperfect information. I'm a fan of usually calculating perfect information first. because one, it's an upper bound. Because if you calculate the perfect information of an intervention, and then you find out, like, even if I reduce everything, it's not worth putting money in, then it's not going to be worth like any of the parameters that are inside of it. So as of such, like, it's not worth calculating perfect partial information at that point. The second thing is that perfect information is just way easier to compute and way easier to intuit. It's probably less sensitive to the normal assumptions that you might have. So that could be one reason why I prefer more perfect information rather than partial information calculating it. But usually it will go down that hierarchy. I'll calculate perfect information first, then perfect partial, and then if I'm really lucky, I might go further down and go like sample information.
How to construct it, but I guess technically it would be some kind of partial differential equation to how much the value of the information increases as you go from less partial to more partial to less partial.
Yeah, this partial doesn't have anything to do with partial differentiation, but it just means part of a model. Yeah, as you get into more partial information, you lose value in those estimates. And you might find, for instance, that like one parameter might be a lot more difficult to reduce the uncertainty of, and then you can also include those costs. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's great.
And finally, just a note, there are some downsides. As we noted earlier, value of information is always relevant to a certain decision to be made. Sometimes the decision can be a bit vague a lot of the times with research, where like, I have information, I'm not really sure how the information will be used. It could be good or bad. An example of this is, what's the value of this talk? What's the value of training and teaching people? And this can be quite difficult to judge because you're not sure. I'm not really sure what decisions you guys are going to make walking away from this talk and how much value that is behind that. The second downside is that it's kind of intuitive. You guys were able to do a pretty decent job playing the game yourself. And I feel like if you look at the distributions themselves, you can usually get a decent estimate of what the value of information is without necessarily doing a calculation. As of such, maybe calculating the explicit value of information might not have as much value of information sometimes. The second thing is that it can get complicated. You can go like, well, in our game, I didn't quite include the value of information given that you could research again, but that's a little bit complicated to think about, as well as what's the value of information if we want to research new things, if we want to add things to our model. And then finally, value of information is only as good as the model it runs on. I kind of like thinking it as a corollary to sensitivity analysis. So obviously sensitivity analysis is just only really ever as good as the model that it's run on. So it might be worth focusing on improving whatever economic model you have. Finally, value of information comes from decision analysis, and it shows up in those textbooks, but GPT-4 will answer all the questions now because we live in this universe. But yeah, any last questions before I go on to who won this game?
I guess I would have one question, partly just because it's sort of a thought that came to mind. The potential for negative values of information could, in my mind, I'm imagining sort of society's usage of information and perhaps erroneous information that might have been biased or lent one way more than another, which caused sort of negative effects down the line where it would have been better not to have been done. I wonder if there's cases where you could assign negative values to information.
Yeah, so there are quite some underlying assumptions that I realized I didn't really acknowledge that much.
No, that's good. I'll probably be interested in reading up more about it.
I think maybe the second part was like the externalities, where there might be like actually other effects other than just informing a decision that you could have in gaining information, and that's something that is also assumed that there are no externalities. But I guess you could, if you wanted to, include that within the decision model. So finally, who won? Out of the three of you, our winner with 460 points was Edward, who did a pretty good job. That is actually the highest score that I've ever had with someone who hasn't played this game before with me. That's higher than the entire Rethink Priorities team, by the way.
It's probably because I use their research implicitly, I guess, in making my investment, so it makes a lot of sense. I was a free rider upon their information, so.
Nice.
How did you become so immersed in this topic, and what's your mental model for getting a better mental model of this?
I got inspired by a talk by Amanda Askell called The Moral Value of Information. What I did is that I got so interested, like, this is so cool. This is actually probably a more general concept. And then I reformalized value of information in its entirety on a piece of paper before I realized that moral value of information is just value of information plus moral. And then I realized, oh, wait. And I just Googled value of information. And then it's like, oh, this is actually like a whole field that I'm aware of. And I just accidentally reformalized. And that got me hooked first off. And then from there, I think the value of information is particularly relevant to things related to quantifying uncertainty. I got interested in quantifying uncertainty because GiveWell doesn't quantify their uncertainty in their charities. I think that's a kind of the most obvious $100 bill on the pavement. So I was interested in that. I think value of information is a very intuitive reason for justifying why I might want to quantify uncertainty in GiveWell charities. GiveWell not only makes decisions about where they want to donate their money towards charities, but also where they want to research and what might be valuable in learning more about to work out whether it's a top charity. So that's kind of like why I'm interested in value of information. I made the original game that's at the very start of my slides for a workshop that I ran in Melbourne. And it's been a hit and people have loved it. I've nerd sniped quite a few people. So yeah.
If you take some of the theory and math from option theory, it's going to be very helpful. I think they've worked out like an option model of the value of information, essentially. It can go both ways. And I mean, I'm happy to think it through with you a bit, but yeah, I think it could be very, very helpful here.
Interesting. I've never heard of that. You'll have to send it to me and kind of look through that.
Happy to send you a few things that I think might be helpful.
Beautiful.
What are
Yeah.
some alternatives to value of information?
Okay, some alternatives in sensitivity analysis. That's probably simpler.
Okay.
So sensitivity analysis is just you have a model and you take a look at how much something is sensitive to a particular parameter. That can be quite valuable in place of value of information analysis.
Okay, got it.
I also wrote a language that I call pedant. You can also find EA forum post on that, which tries to do dimensional checking for you, but that's still very much in development. I kind of go back to it from time to time as a hobby. And that's written in Haskell for any Haskell lovers out there.
Now we get to the software engineering content at the end of the talk.
I was thinking about that. It's not very software engineering based, and this
That's
is
okay.
now
No,
software
this is
engineering
fine.
based.
Yeah.
I've been playing with Haskell for a while, and it's definitely my favorite language so
Okay.
far. Pedant is itself a functional programming language. It's fun. I get to design my own type systems that I'm going to base a language around.
That's really cool. Maybe there's room in the future for like a Haskell pedant focused
Maybe.
talk.
Yeah, maybe that's the next software engineering talk.
This has been really awesome. And thanks again to Sam for the really cool presentation. I'm going to be thinking about this for a while. So definitely a lot to dig into.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
Have a good
Appreciate
day.
it.
Thanks for coming.
See ya.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.